Thank you. Erez, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. I'm trying to share my screen, and I think the host needs to allow me to share. Yes, that is now working. Okay. Can everybody now see my screen? Yeah, great. So thank you very much, Yanti, for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm very happy to talk to you about the work that me and my team were doing on accent bias in the UK. And also at the end of the talk, I'll give a very sort of brief mention of some similar work that's happening in other European contexts, and hopefully find out about more work on this topic that's going on, and maybe generate interest in doing more work on this kind of thing in other languages and in other countries. So let me just start off by this sort of very well-known quote from George Bernard Shaw in his introduction to Pygmalion, where he says that the moment an Englishman opens his mouth, another Englishman despises him. And I like this quote because it really encapsulates the fact that we have attitudes to language. And the minute we start hearing somebody speak, we're going to infer various characteristics about an individual. We're going to decide what social groups we think that individual might belong to. And then we're going to make judgments about whether this is somebody that we wish to know, somebody that we wish to associate with, and in particular, for what I'll be talking about today, somebody that we wish to employ in a professional context. And even though, as I'm sure many of you are aware, there's quite a bit of work on these general attitudes that one has to language, there's a great deal less on the ways in which these attitudes can affect issues like social mobility and access to employment. So we know outside of linguistics, from work in sociology and related fields, that there are long-standing patterns of inequality in professional hiring in the UK, so large discrepancies based on an individual's social background. And we also know as linguists that accent is a key signal of social background, and so can impede access to elite professions. And there was work on this, particularly within the social psychology of language in the 1970s and 1980s by notably people like Howie Giles and colleagues. But the specific role of accent in perpetuating unequal life outcomes in the UK had been underexplored and has been underexplored for much of the past number of decades. And in particular, until the project that I'm going to be describing to you today, there had been no large-scale survey of the ways in which accent attitudes in the UK might affect sort of judgments of employability that were based on actual audio stimuli. So controlled experimental testing of the ways in which people respond to voices with different accents. So it was essentially this major gap that we identified that we sought to address in the Accent Bias in Britain project. This was a project that ran from 2017 until 2022. That was based, it was a cooperation between Queen Mary in London, which was my former institution, and the University of York. And it included various linguists that you can see here on the slide. So me, Devyani Sharma, Dominic Watt, as well as Armando Cardozo, and then also social psychologists and people working in legal studies, because we ended up focusing on the legal profession as the target profession that we investigated. Now, the Accent Bias in Britain project overall was a series of different experiments. So it was fully within an experimental paradigm that we were looking at these things. And we ran attitude experiments of various different kinds, so attitudes to accent labels, to audio stimuli, and among different listener groups. We also then ran a number of experiments that were trying to dig into the specific cognitive mechanisms that underlie the ways in which people develop attitudes to language and how those attitudes to language are expressed in different types of contexts. And then we also designed and tested different anti-bias interventions. But for the purposes of the talk this afternoon, I'm just going to focus on 3 of the different experiments that we ran. So obviously, if you have questions about some of the other experiments, about the cognitive mechanisms or the interventions, I'm happy to talk about those as well. So let me dive right in with the first experiment, sort of where we started. And this was an experiment looking at the attitudes that people have to accent concepts. So really, when just given a label for an accent in the UK, so Birmingham English, Queen's English, received pronunciation, how do people react to this? What is their stereotype of this particular variety? And in our study, what we wanted to do and what we did was replicate that work that was done by Bishop and colleagues, published in 2005, looking similarly at attitudes to different accent labels. And Bishop and colleagues' work was actually itself a replication of earlier work that had been done by Giles in 1970. And so we were interested in replicating this study again so as to get a 50-year time period for comparison of whether these attitudes to these different labels, these different concepts had changed. So we did a fairly straightforward survey with a representative sample of the UK public, so just over 800 people. What happened in the experiment is that respondents were presented with 38 different accent labels and asked to rate each of them for how prestigious they think that accent sounds and how pleasant they think that accent sounds. And again, this replicates the methodology that was used by Bishop and colleagues and by Giles. Now, I won't show you the results for all 38 labels. I'm just going to focus in on the 14 labels that existed in all three of the studies. So the Giles study, where the data was collected in 1969, Bishop and colleagues from data collected in 2004, and then our own study where we collected data in 2019. And you can see here on the slide, organized from left to right, those were that were the highest rated, and this is in terms of prestige, to those that were lowest rated. And the most striking thing about this graph here is the relative stability in judgments. So we find that across the 50-year period, you have RP, received pronunciation, for example, rated very much at the top. So rated as the most prestigious accent. And then similarly at the very bottom of the table, again, across the 50-year period, you have Liverpool and Birmingham, rated as the least prestigious sounding, and just slightly above those, Afro-Caribbean and Indian. So what we're seeing is that generally when we look across all 38 of the accents that we tested, so national accent concepts, labels for national accents, so Scottish English, Irish English, things like that, as well as various inner circle accents, so inner circle Englishes, so Australian English, American English, these are all very much top ranked and are top ranked across the 50-year period. Whereas accents that refer to different industrial and ethnic varieties, Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, Indian English, and so on, always appear at the bottom. So it is, we were sort of surprised by the stability of these rankings. We take slight comfort in the fact that there's a slightly smaller difference in contrast among the different rankings. So if you look at the blue line, which is 2019, you can see that the slope is slightly flatter than the green line from 2004 or the orange line from 1969. So it seems like the differences between accents are perhaps becoming smaller, but nevertheless, we're seeing this enduring hierarchy of prestige as we describe it. Now, one of our most significant findings in terms of social differences among respondents, we looked at a variety of different things. We looked at gender, we looked at region, and we looked at age. And age certainly came out as the most significant difference that we find. And generally, we find that across the board, younger listeners give higher ratings to all accents. So it seems like younger listeners are rating all accents as sounding more prestigious. And when we first saw this, we thought this could be indicative of a sort of change in progress. Perhaps sort of negative attitudes to certain varieties are disappearing or at least diminishing. But when we dig into this in a bit more detail, we see that the pattern is somewhat more complex. So here you can see that we've color-coded different groups of accents. So in this sort of yellow gold color, you have the national sort of traditional and rural accents of the UK. Then in the green color, you have sort of foreign and ethnic accents. And in the blue, you see these industrial accents. And what we find is that actually younger listeners, younger respondents are rating the foreign and ethnic heritage accents and the working class and industrial accents higher than the older people are. But the pattern is reversed for the national and traditional rural accents. And what this means is that we're seeing this sort of lack of an apparent bias effect among younger people for certain types of accents. That's the foreign and ethnic heritage and the working class and industrial. But as soon as we start moving up the age scale, as soon as we start looking at older respondents, we see that that disappears, and that actually it's the older respondents that prefer the UK national and traditional rural accents. And what's interesting is that this pattern that we're finding across the different accent groups parallels exactly what was found by Bishop and colleagues in 2004. And because of this, because even, nearly 20 years later, we're finding the same shift across the age groups. And interestingly, the shift seems to always happen right around the age of 45. We argue that this is not actually a pattern of change in progress, but is instead age grading. So it seems that what happens is that when people get older and move into sort of middle life, they become somewhat more judgmental about accents, and certain types of biases emerge. And we hypothesize along the lines of Coupland and Bishop that this has to do with the extent to which people are embedded in various standard language markets. So having been professionally socialized, come to expect certain types of standard languages required. So as Coupland and Bishop said in 2007, young people are less embedded in the conservative ideology of positively evaluating standard accents, and so aren't necessarily downgrading these foreign accents or working class accents. Whereas as everyone gets older and moves into the professional sphere, these kinds of more conservative ideologies appear to emerge. So what looked at first like a potential positive outcome, actually that accent bias is potentially diminishing, appears not to be the case, and instead appears to be more a product of age grading and emergent normativity in midlife. Okay, so that was the major finding of the first study, when we're just looking at accent concepts. So how do people react very stereotypically to this idea of, say, a Cornish accent or a Glaswegian accent? But as Bishop and colleagues say, we know that these kinds of conceptual accent evaluations tap into deeply conservative ideologies, because I'm just asking you what you think of a particular concept in your mind, and may obscure more subtle socio-psychological shifts and specific contextual effects. And so we were interested in going beyond this and testing things in a somewhat more nuanced way. And really, we wanted to ask, are such accent preferences, these kinds of this hierarchy of prestige that we find with labels, do we also find them with actual audio stimuli in relation to an actual person and in a particular situated context? So for a second experiment, we decided then to look at respondents' attitudes to voices. So this was operationalized in the form of a verbal guise study, where respondents heard people speaking with multiple different accents. Again, this was done with a representative sample of the population of England, just shy of 850 individuals. We actually did this across all 4 nations of the UK, but I'm just going to focus on results for England this today. And what the listeners were told they were evaluating was the interview performance of candidates for an entry-level solicitor position at a corporate law firm in the UK. So they told they were hearing somebody who's applying for a job, an entry-level job as a solicitor in a law firm in Britain. The candidates themselves that listeners heard were all young men who were native speakers of one of 5 English accents, with 2 speakers per accent to try and get away from individual speaker effects. And the 5 accents that we looked at were received pronunciation, estuary English, multicultural London English, general Northern English, and urban West Yorkshire English. And we chose these 5 accents for a variety of reasons. Received pronunciation is the national standard, and so we wanted to see what this how the national standard is responded to. We then have estuary English, which is the sort of generational descendant of Cockney, so a non-standard variety spoken primarily in the southeast of England, and that is traditionally associated with white speakers. Multicultural London English is then a newer non-standard variety in the south of England, and in contrast to estuary English, is associated with Black and Asian speakers. General Northern English is a term that's emerged to describe a sort of middle-class variety of Northern English from the north of England, a variety that's heard as Northern, but not specifically localizable to a particular place in the north. And then Urban West Yorkshire English is a non-standard variety associated particularly with a particular place, one of the more traditional non-standard varieties in the north. I'm going to try and play very short clips of these so that you can hear what they sound like in case you're not familiar with them. So this is received pronunciation.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
Did you hear that? Yep, okay. So I'll play that again, received pronunciation.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
Then estuary English.
I worked as a part-time shop manager. I worked as a part-time shop manager.
Multicultural London English.
I worked as a part-time shop manager. I worked as a part-time shop manager.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
This is General Northern English, sorry.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
And then Urban West Yorkshire English.
I worked as a part-time shop manager. I worked as a part-time shop manager.
Okay, so hopefully you can hear that these are audibly distinct, and if you're not, familiar with these accents or familiar with the accent landscape of Britain, you can take my word for it that they do sort of call up very strong stereotypes when British listeners hear them. So the stimuli that they were hearing were all audio responses to interview questions, again, for a job as an entry-level solicitor. Some of the questions required legal expertise, whereas others focus more on general professional skills. And all of the stimuli were developed with lawyers who were on an advisory board for the project. So they really reflected the kinds of things that someone is asked in an interview of this kind. We were really trying to contextualize the responses as much as possible to make it as ecologically valid as it could be. Listeners rated all 10 speakers, so 5 accents, 2 speakers per accent, each speaker responding to a different question, so they never heard the same question or speaker twice. And they rated the speakers on how suitable they thought that the speaker was for a job as an entry-level solicitor. And then after rating the listeners, they provided various kinds of information about their social and linguistic backgrounds, some the more classic demographic information. We also asked them questions about their beliefs about social mobility in the UK and whether they thought there were problems with it. And then we asked them, we gave them a standardized psychological questionnaire that measures what's been called motivation to control prejudiced reactions. And this is an individual difference measure that measures the extent to which people are concerned about whether they seem prejudiced to others. So it's not necessarily a measure of self-report of prejudice, how prejudiced am I, but how important is it to me that I seem prejudiced or not in interaction. And we did this because this has been shown in previous work in psychology to affect the kinds of attitudinal responses that you get. Okay, so moving on to the results then from this voices study. Overall, the first thing to note is that if we just look at mean evaluations across the 5 accents, there's no significant difference. So you can see here in the plot that there are clearly distributional differences or apparent differences between, say, average ratings of RP and average ratings of MLE, but these are not significantly differentiated when we just look at accent on its own. And this is surprising, particularly given the stability of this hierarchy of prestige that I described in the first study, and that's also been shown in previous work. Now, this isn't to say that listeners had no attitudes to accents whatsoever. It's just that their attitudes to accents were consistently moderated by other factors. And once again, the most important moderating factor was age. So here you see attitudes, again, to the 5 accents as a function of respondent age. And what we find is that among younger listeners, younger respondents, there's no significant differentiation between the accents. We also see that younger listeners are rating all of the accents more highly overall. So all of the speakers is more suitable for employment. Yet as soon as we start moving to the older listeners, and again, this significant difference really emerges right around age 45, we start to see a clear distinction between RP, Urban West Yorkshire English and General Northern English on one hand, which are rated all more highly, and then the two non-standard Southern varieties, that is Estuary English and Multicultural London English, who are rated less highly. So this is really the main distinction that we find, is that non-standard Southern varieties of English are being significantly downgraded for suitability for work as a lawyer among older respondents, that is respondents over the age of 45. Now, again, given what we had found in the first study, looking at accent labels and concepts, we think that this is similarly indicative of a pattern of age grading, that as people become acculturated to professional workplace norms, they start to become more critical of certain accents, and those accents they appear to be more critical of are the Southern non-standard varieties. Now, there are a couple more slightly more complex findings in the data set that I want to briefly walk you through as well. And these both involve higher level interactions with other respondent factors. So this, what you see here is plotted is a complex interaction between respondent region, whether they're from the South, the Midlands, or the North of England, and whether the response itself was one that required legal expertise or one that was just about general professional skills. So for example, an expertise question was, what's the difference between contract law and tort law? And they had to provide a response that showed that they know what that is. Whereas one that didn't require expertise was just something like, tell me about when you worked in a team, an experience you had working in a team, something like that. Now we find that, as expected, responses that require legal expertise are judged more highly overall. So speakers are judged as more suitable to work as a lawyer when they're demonstrating via the content of their speech that they have legal expertise. And in most cases, this expertise effect actually washes out any differences that one might find across accents. But there are two places where this does not occur. So for older listeners in the South and in the Midlands, we do find a difference between expert responses and non-expert responses, but we find that even for expert responses, speakers with an accent from an Estuary English or a Multicultural London English accent are still being significantly downgraded, even when their response contains expertise. So we find this response both for their non-expert responses and for their expert responses. For listeners in the Midlands, older listeners in the Midlands, we only find this effect, this sort of accent bias effect, for responses that don't require expertise. So overall, we seem to have a pattern where all speakers get an expertise boost. In most cases, that boost is enough to overcome any accent bias effects that may exist, but that's not the case. That is, accent bias persists if the listener is older and from the Midlands or from the South, or to a lesser degree from the Midlands. And the reason that this is important is because if we actually look at the statistics, the distribution of who is it that's doing the majority of the hiring in the UK, who is it that's sitting on the other side of the interview table if you're going in to apply for a job as a solicitor, I think it's something like over 2/3 of those people are in fact older people from the South of England. So these are precisely the people who are showing these persistent accent bias effects against these Southern non-standard varieties. There's just one more effect that I'm going to show you here, and this is in relation to motivation to control a prejudice response. So you'll recall I mentioned a moment ago that this measures the extent to which you don't want to appear prejudiced in interaction. And again, people who have high MCPR scores, so a high motivation to not appear prejudiced, are rating speakers more highly across the board. And again, this can trump or overcome any accent bias effects. There are a couple cases where this does not happen, where accent bias nevertheless still emerges, and it's among the same group of listeners. So it's the older listeners in the South and in the Midlands that are again downgrading speakers of estuary English and multicultural London English, though here the effect only exists among speakers with low motivation to control prejudice. So MCPR seems to be a somewhat stronger moderating factor, say, than expertise, but doesn't always have the same effect depending on the listener's age and the listener's region. So just to summarize what we find in this second experiment, we find that the hierarchy of accent prestige that we had found in the label study is mitigated to a certain extent for audio stimuli. So once people are listening to actual voices within a particular situated context, the biases or the differences in judgments across accents are less stark, less visible. We find that accent evaluations are moderated by respondent age, but again, we believe that this appears more indicative of age grading than it does of any sort of attitudinal change that is taking place. And then we also find that bias effects are mitigated in complex ways by expert content and by motivation to control a prejudice response. Though again, this does not happen across the board. And in particular, we're finding that it's these older listeners in the south of England that show the most persistent patterns of bias. Okay, so to summarize then in an even shorter way, what we're finding then is that hearing real voices in a situation with real consequences still shows bias, but to a reduced extent as compared to accent labels. And then our next question is, to what extent are the findings of experiment 2 then actually ecologically valid in replicating what would happen in a real hiring context? That second experiment was just among, members of the British public. So 850 people, adults in the UK, not necessarily people who ever worked in a law firm or have experience with this particular kind of situation. So we wondered, are these milder biases also found among professional recruiters themselves, particularly those with knowledge and expertise in law? Are they also found if listeners are instructed to specifically listen for the quality of the response? So not only is this person hireable, but how good of an answer do you think this is? And in a real workplace. So in order to study this, we ran a third experiment, which was another verbal guise study, but this time we were focusing on working lawyers and legal recruiters. And we did this via fieldwork in commercial law firms in London, Leeds, and York. So we went in there and we conducted the experiments in the workplace to really try and make sure that people were as much in context as possible. Overall, the task was pretty much the same. So listeners were again evaluating the interview performance of candidates for an entry-level position, the same candidates with the same 5 accents. But unlike in the prior study, all 10 of the questions required technical expertise. So now we had a listener population that actually had this expertise. So we made all the questions about specific legal issues. And we also varied the quality of the responses. So we developed responses that were objectively better and worse responses to these specific questions. This quality manipulation, again, was done with the cooperation of the lawyers who were on the advisory board. And we then pre-tested this quality manipulation in written form with 25 other lawyers who were otherwise unconnected to the project, right? So we wanted to be sure that this really was a question that pretty much any trained lawyer would say is a better or worse response. And so the responses were designed to elicit the systematic quality difference. We didn't want to be too extreme. So the better responses got an average rating of 6.5 out of 10, whereas the worst responses an average rating of 3.5 out of 10. So enough for there to be a quality difference, but not for it to be too obvious that we would just be getting ceiling and floor effects. Okay, so we run this study with the lawyers in their law firms. And what do we find? So you can see the responses here now on the slide. Essentially, we found that the lawyers were exceedingly good at determining whether a response was good or bad. You can see that the good responses, the ones that had been prejudged as good, are all rated as significantly better than the poor responses. And we also see that there is no real accent effect across the board. So it really appears that in this task, the lawyers were very able to just ignore accent differences and simply focus on response quality as the sole factor that determined how suitable they thought this candidate was for employment. Now, it's interesting to compare what these lawyers were doing in the workplace with people with similar professional experience were doing in the previous study, in the nationwide study that we had. So I said before that the nationwide study was just the members of the UK public, 850 members of the UK public, and within those 850 people, there were lawyers and people who work as legal recruiters. So we went and looked at what those people were doing. And when we extract just them from the previous study, we see the kinds of bias patterns that we would anticipate and that parallel what was found in the sample overall. So basically estuary English and multicultural London English being significantly downgraded. So it's not the case that lawyers and legal recruiters do not have accent bias or never express any kinds of biased reactions to accents. It's instead the case that when we were with them in their workplace, this is how they reacted. So from this third study, we take away that there's no evidence of bias among lawyers in a workplace, and instead the quality of response is the sole factor that determined ratings overall. And just to say that this lack of an accent effect that I've just shown you in aggregate is also replicated when we do more fine-grained comparisons across accents and speakers. So it really is quite a robust lack of an effect. But it's not the case that lawyers as individuals have no accent biases or preferences, because when we look at their responses in the other study, in the nationwide study, we do find those biased responses emerging. So instead, it appears to be something about the situated context, the fact that we went into law firms and they were performing the test there, as well as the type of goal-directed behavior that they were engaged in. So we introduced this quality manipulation and we asked them to pay specific attention to whether this was a good response or a bad response. And it appears to be those two things that cause the lawyers to focus simply on content and quality rather than on accent. Okay, so if we take the three experiments that I've just walked you through together, we find in the accent label study, this very, very sharp distinctions among accents, this kind of age grading with normativity emerging in middle age, and a replication of a basic ideological pattern that is very familiar within the UK and that has been stable for at least the past 50 years. When we move to the voices study, the second study, we're still seeing distinctions, but they're fewer and milder. We have bias, but here only against the Southern working class accents. And we also see that that bias can be mitigated by job context, expertise, and motivation to control a prejudice response. And then finally, in the third study, in the workplace study, we find no distinctions among the accents and instead simply focus on objective quality differences. And when we think about what the differences are between these three studies, as we move from the first study to the second, essentially what we've done is we've introduced a contextual element. We've contextualized people's attitudes, asked them not to just think about language generally, but actually think about it in the context of a given voice. So they're really listening to a particular individual and in the context of a particular profession. And then when we move from the second to the third, from the voices study to the workplace study, what we've done is we've moved to an expert listener population. So we've added an expertise as a new dimension. And then we've also introduced very specific task goals. Now, trying to understand and conceptualize the differences, the similarities and the differences that we're finding across these three different studies as a way of developing a more robust theory of what it means to have an attitude to an accent more generally, we found it useful to use and to draw on the theory of planned behavior as developed within social psychology. And within the theory of planned behavior, the idea is that any behavior that we engage in, say, I make a behavioral judgment about whether I should hire you or not, or in an interview, I decide to hire you or not. The immediate precursor to a behavior is a behavioral intention. So I develop some kind of cognitive intention about the behavior that I'm going to engage in. And what determines that cognitive intention are three things. The first is my attitude toward that behavior. So do I think it would be positive or negative if I were to offer you a job? The subjective norms that govern that behavior, and the perceived control that I have over that behavior. So subjective norms, is it okay, for example, to listen to something like accent when making judgments about whether someone is suitable for employment? And perceived behavioral control, do I have the ability to judge whether you are qualified for this job or not? And when we use this as a general heuristic or schematic for thinking about the results that we find that in the first study with accent labels, we're not even necessarily dealing with behaviors here. We're just actually trying to access what gets described as general attitudes that are fully decontextualized from behavior. And so we're not sensitive to norms or controls. Instead, we're just going to the attitude box by itself. The second study, in contrast, has a link to behavior. So in voices, there's a particular action, right, which is hiring in a particular context of an interview, and there's a particular target, right? It's the person speaking. And so the theory of planned behavior would argue that we should start to find effects of attitudes to behavior, as well as effects of norms and effects of control. And we would argue that this is why we're finding this more mitigated responses, this more mitigated bias in the second study, because precisely now things like subjective norms and perceived control are playing a role. And then the role of norms and perceived control is only then heightened when we move to the workplace. Here we have a very direct link to behavior, and with people who are experienced actually engaging in this behavior. There are also sharper norms for conduct. So, many of the lawyers in the law firms that we worked with afterwards spoke to us about how they have all received various kinds of unconscious bias training and diversity training. And so they're very aware that there are certain things they're supposed to be ignoring in these kinds of contexts. So that is a norm of conduct that will then affect the behavioral intentions that are generated. And then also the fact that they have expertise of content also enhances their perceived behavioral control. They are actually able to judge the quality of response or the quality of a candidate better than someone with no legal expertise. So we find the theory of planned behavior as a useful way to be thinking about the contrasts that we're finding across the three different studies that we've done. And then to be thinking about what does it mean when we say that somebody has an attitude to language more generally, right? We're really trying to push this idea that we shouldn't think about attitudes to language in the abstract, but we instead need to think about attitudes as precursors of potential behavioral intentions. And that if we're interested in looking at the social impact that attitudes can have, that language attitudes can have, then we need to situate it in some kind of theory of behavior, like the theory of planned behavior that I've shown you here. And also, just very briefly, the theory of planned behavior is a useful construct for also thinking about how we might go about trying to intervene and develop different kinds of anti-bias interventions. It's essentially giving us a list of things that we can try and target to reduce the kinds of bias that we find in the real world. So we can target the subjective norms of an institution or target people's perceived behavioral control. And just very briefly, this is what we did in another experiment that we ran as part of the project. We tested 5 different interventions that have been proposed in the literature for reducing various kinds of bias. And I won't go into the detail of all of these, but I will say that of the 5 that we tested, there was one that worked and that had a significant impact on reducing specifically accent bias. And that was simply raising awareness that accent bias exists. So listeners who were presented with information prior to doing the task, saying that sometimes people are experience bias because of their accent, then reduced the differences that we found between the accents in comparison to a control group. So this appears to be very simply just raising someone's perceived behavioral control, showing them that they can decide to ignore accent, and that is has a positive effect on reducing the bias responses that we find. Okay. To wrap up, I want to walk us through some work in other European contexts. And it's interesting because when Ianti first wrote to me about giving this talk and said, you know, it'd be great if you could also include other European contexts, I was like, yeah, sure, great, no problem. And then when you start looking around, you actually find that there's not very much in other languages and other contexts. And actually, there was a recent meta-analysis done, published here in 2022, of specifically this question. So accents and hiring. So the precise thing that we were looking at. And they looked through all the literature that they could find for the past, I think it was 20 or 25 years. And within that literature, there was actually a very, very limited diversity of languages and national contexts that were considered. The majority are in the US. There have been some in the UK, but generally the majority are on English. The only real exception to this in Europe is German in various contexts. So I'm going to show you some studies on German. I should say, too, that when I say that the only studies that exist, I'm speaking very specifically about experimental approaches that adopt a quantitative tools, right? So it's not to say that there are not discussions of accent bias in hiring in other ways, but specifically experimental quantitative work on the topic. Really, all that's out there at the moment is on English and on German. Interestingly, so I've said German, but there's some work on English, sort of non-native Englishes or accented Englishes in various European countries. So I'm showing you, for example, the study by Roussel on English in Germany. So the way in which this was done, the setup for this experiment is listeners were told that they're going to be hearing somebody who was applying for a job at a German university, that all the speakers are themselves German, but that the university requires that in interviews, people speak in English. And they did this for a variety of reasons, but they were trying to remove any effects that people might have, sort of stereotypes about non-native speakers or stereotypes about migrants and things like that. So the idea was to test a non-native accent among listeners who are would themselves be non-native speakers of that variety. So English spoken by Germans, listened to by Germans. And they compared this then to a native English speaker, and they had two accent conditions, one that was weak and one that was strong. And then again, they varied the interview response quality. So there was a high quality response and a low quality response. We can see that looking, say, at the native speaker as a kind of baseline judgment of quality, we can see that the listeners are certainly able to perceive this difference. So the high quality answer is heard as much more hireable than the low quality answer. And we can see that we find a similar pattern for the weakly accented non-native accent speaker. So again, a German with a non-native accent in English. High quality versus low quality distinction matters, but this speaker is judged as significantly less hireable than the native English speaker, even though listeners were told that the job is to teach in German, right? So English is not actually required for the job, but just the fact of hearing someone with a non-native accent made them appear or made them rated significantly less hireable. And then when we go to the strong non-native accent, we see that now they're significantly downgraded, much more. They're seen as not hireable at all. And the quality distinction no longer matters. So whether it's a good answer or a bad answer, they're just heard as non-hireable with a strong non-native accent. So there's some sort of controlled experimental work on this, on various non-native varieties of English, which is clearly important because English, for better or worse, is increasingly permeating itself into different professional spheres. And so there is a huge amount of non-native English, say, being spoken in various places in Europe and around the world. And nevertheless, we seem to be finding still these kinds of native biases against non-native speakers. Okay, but looking in other languages themselves, so not taking English into account, I'm just going to give you a few examples of work that's been done on German. So there's the study by Tamara Rakic and colleagues from 2011, where she was looking at what she described as a standard German variety, so sort of a standard Bundesdeutsch, versus various regionally accented varieties of German, so a Bavarian accent, a Berlin accent, and a Saxon accent. And this study was replicated both as a verbal guise and as a matched guise. Listeners were told that they were hearing somebody who was applying for a position as sort of a mid-level manager, so, a professional position. And we find that pretty much across the board, both in the verbal guise and the matched guise, and both in terms of competence and in terms of perceived higher ability, the standard German accents do better than the regional accents. The regional accents here, just averaged together, are significantly downgraded across the board. This is perhaps not surprising. We all know about standard language ideologies and the strength of standard language ideologies, particularly in the German-speaking world, but it's nevertheless useful to see these actual effects when we contextualize specifically in a workplace context, because then we can think about the kinds of ramifications, societal ramifications that these kinds of attitudes can have. Looking at a similar kind of example, this time varieties of German in Switzerland. So this comes from work from my colleague here in Bern, Erez Levon, back in 2015. And here he's testing 3 varieties of German. So 2 Swiss varieties, Bernese German is there in blue, and Zurich German is there in pink. And so these are dialects of German, and then a standard Bundesdeutsch German variety. And this was a matched guise study. And what listeners heard was somebody speaking, and then they were asked, is this somebody that you would hire for this job? And the job, I believe, was as a secretary, some sort of administrative position. Then, is this somebody that you would hire as your surgeon? So another professional context, but slightly higher status, higher expectations of training. And the final one was, is this somebody you would like to go traveling with, which is how we operationalized a kind of warmth or likability judgment. And basically we see that Zurich German comes out across the top, comes on top across the board. So is the most preferred variety for all 3 of them. And that Bundesdeutsch German, sort of standard German, you see it emerging, sort of doing well, really only in the most statusful condition. That is this somebody that you would want to be a surgeon? And so the pattern replicates the sort of unique diglossic ideological situation in Switzerland, where local German varieties, local German dialects are preferred over standard German, but we're nevertheless seeing this sort of incipient standard language ideology that could then potentially have an effect if people are, trying to move into particular kinds of elite professions. And then finally, this is a slightly different kind of situation and a slightly different kind of employment context. But I'm showing you here some recent work by Koppensteiner and Lenz on what's described, or what the label is, pure High German versus a sort of standard, local standard version of Austrian German in Austria. And what they did was they played these different speakers of German to Austrian listeners, some of whom were untrained people, as they're calling them here. So just, it was actually academics who were being told to speak in a local standard way, versus newscasters. So they were interested in the effect that vocal training and a sort of imposed standard might have on people's perceptions. And when we look at the plot on the left, so speakers were asked, to what extent do you consider what you've heard as pure High German? So this concept that listeners might have of perfect German. We can see that all the German speakers, so those who begin with a G, are rated as the most pure High German sounding, and all the Austrian speakers are the least. But when instead they asked, to what extent do you think this person would optimally fit as a newscaster for the Austrian public broadcaster, the results become more complicated. So now we actually have Austrians that are doing the best, and then, a couple of the Germans, specifically the German newscasters themselves. So people are clearly tapping into some kind of newscaster voice. And I show this just to say that, there's not necessarily a direct translation between ideologies of standard and then what's considered appropriate for certain types of professions. There can be workplace-specific norms, where clearly it seems here that, being a newscaster for the Austrian public broadcaster has a particular linguistic norm associated with it. That is slightly different from just a pure, what is pure High German standard language ideology. So we're tapping into the ways in which language might allow access or impede access to particular kinds of professions. Okay, so those are some examples, again, of quantitative experimental work that's looked at this in German-speaking contexts. And just to say, in other contexts, there's a lot of discussion of the potential of accent bias, right? So, for example, those of you who follow, who work on French or follow things happening in the French-speaking world, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about glottophobia. You also get this in Spanish-speaking places. And there have been various surveys. So this is, I'm showing you here work by Blanchet and colleagues from 2022, where, in a survey, people say that linguistic discrimination exists and is felt, nearly 95% of the respondents saying that it is most present in employment interviews or in employment contexts. But as of yet, there hasn't been any detailed experimental testing of what precisely these kinds of glottophobia look like, what specific kinds of linguistic signals are triggering them, and the ways in which these might vary across specific contexts and across different listeners. So I'm using this final section as sort of a call for people who work on languages other than English to perhaps engage in this kind of work, because I think we do need more investigations of what clearly is a very real social and linguistic phenomenon. Thank you very much.